Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. In the first grade, a teacher at PS 17 changed the name of Angelo Falcón to Angelo Falcón. He recognized it as an assault on his being, and it set off one of the most remarkable fighting machines produced in the city's neighborhoods. He went from grammar school to graduate school. His credentials make him a political scientist, but he calls himself a guerrilla researcher. And as president of the National Institute for Latino Policy, he does battle every day to improve the lives and political clout of Latinos. And he's my guest today. How do you do?
Great to be here.
I just want to ask a few questions. The difference between Hispanics and Latinos is what? Latinos come from South America, supposedly originally, and Hispanics from Spain?
To be honest, at this point, I really don't care. There have been all sorts of debates about that and all sorts of scholarly articles, but in the end, you know, it's people's usage of the term, and most people use them interchangeably at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, there were all sorts of funny things. For example, I remember my good friend Miguel Perez, a columnist, used to be with the Daily News. He's a Lehman now. He made a big deal about who wants to be, in terms of the term Hispanic, he said, who wants to be anybody's panic? You know, so you go from that to all sorts of things. And then we used to, when we started the Institute back in '82, we were concerned that Puerto Ricans were kind of getting, so some Puerto Ricans that were doing well and were trying to distance themselves from the poor Puerto Ricans. And so we used to say that Hispanic was a Puerto Rican trying to pass. So, you know, it's, these terms are very, I think, very flexible at this point.
Well, you started out as the Puerto Rican Institute.
Right.
And I've been thinking a lot about it because there was a report from the Community Service Society about youth, and Puerto Rican youth seems to be having the most difficulty. They're the most unemployed. What is it, between 14? It's up to really 24, I think.
Right, 16 to 24,
yeah. And then they're not only unemployed, but they're the highest number of dropouts out of school.
Right.
But in recent years, with all this discussion of Latino and Hispanic, it seems to me that the Puerto Ricans have disappeared in the greater sphere. Is that?
No,
I don't mean disappeared, but you know.
Well, that's been a big battle that we've had to deal with, the issue of visibility. Years ago, in the Puerto Rican community, we had the battle of trying to get people to pay attention to this community. And we were, you know, I like to think that, you know, like to characterize our history as, at one point in the '60s, we actually got a lot of attention from social scientists and others. And we were kind of like the guinea pigs of kind of social experimentation.
The Young Lords were Puerto Rican.
Right, and for the most part, not all. But, you know, we also were the subjects of research by, around the cultural poverty issue and Oscar Lewis and all that stuff. And, you know, we were the guys in the Blackboard Jungle movie and West Side Story. So we got some attention, but it was all kind of negative stuff. So we were trying to, you know, get more attention in terms of the media, paying, you know, and so Puerto Ricans, you know, we made some headway, but then especially in the '90s, when people started focusing on the issue of immigration, all of a sudden, Puerto Ricans are technically not immigrants, we're more migrants because we're U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico.
I wanted to talk about that.
And so what happened was that all of a sudden Puerto Ricans became kind of, as you said, kind of invisible. We were there, but people were not paying attention to our issues. And all of a sudden, all Latinos, because of media attention to immigration issues, all Latinos were newcomers, with people that their main problem is they just got here, as opposed to, you know, Mexican Americans who've been here for hundreds of years, you know, Puerto Ricans who, you know, have been here a long time in a place like New York City. So it's become a challenge to try to kind of raise the issues of Puerto Ricans these days, because a lot of policymakers just they just homogenize the population. They don't want to deal with the issue. And then lately, the other problem we have is racial fatigue. People these days, the most progressive people, they don't want to hear it. You know, identity politics destroyed the left, you know. So you have all these obstacles in terms of just getting your issues on the table, getting people to pay attention to these problems.
But I remember in the '50s with the migration of a lot of Puerto Ricans in the city, and poor people, and then the questions of their living conditions and what they were doing in jobs. But it was always interesting to me because they were American citizens. They're American citizens who don't speak English by and large, or a lot of them were. And that's so different from a Dominican who comes here who's not an American citizen and doesn't talk. It's so, within the Latino community, is there a feeling between the different groups?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, you know, what happens is a lot of people kind of think of Latinos, let's say in New York, we're like 28% of the population, and they kind of think of us in general, you know, as a bunch of people talk to each other. But what I find interesting is the communication that there is between the different Latino groups, Ecuadorians, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans, and there's a certain degree of political competition, especially between Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. You're beginning to see, you have the first Ecuadorian gets elected to the assembly from Queens. So you see all this stuff, but it's not like it's coming together. It's not like there's this big unified group of people that are talking to each other, but rather they're going in many ways, they're separate ways. And there are, you know, stereotypes within the Latino community. So, you know, there was a book by Bob Smith on Mexican New York, where he did this ethnographies of Mexicans. And, you know, you have these comments by some Mexicans, oh, I don't want to be identified as a Puerto Rican. They're all on welfare. So for a lot of folks, it's hard to conceive that there would be these differences within the Latino community, because they kind of, you know, just kind of generalize us. You know, we're the guys who get them their, you know, sandwiches in the deli and deliver the stuff. You know, so it's for Puerto Ricans, it's been interesting because the other part of it, as you mentioned, coming here as U.S. citizens, it also raises interesting questions, I think, for the newer Latinos, and that is the holy grail in the immigration movement is citizenship, becoming a citizen. Well, Puerto Ricans come here as citizens, and they're at the bottom, you know, many of us are at the bottom of the barrel down, you know, and so it raises questions about, well, wait a minute, it's got to be obviously more complicated than just getting your legal status. There's an issue of kind of a racialization of certain groups in this country that creates, you know, all sorts of problems. So citizenship isn't the answer in and of itself, and the Puerto Rican case really brings that out.
The Puerto Ricans, do they have the highest rate of poverty?
Yeah, well, you know,
is that just in New York City that more affluent Puerto Ricans have moved away?
Well, that's part of the issue. The thing is, when the CSS report came out a couple of weeks ago, I got a call from the New York Times. You know, what do you think of this? I told the guy, listen, it's nothing new.
Surprise,
you know, the numbers have been pretty consistent over time. In fact, I referred him. I said, look, you know, there was a front page article on this in your newspaper in 2001 on the front page. So I told him, read it, and all you have to do is just change the dates and some names, and you got the article written. You know, it's the same. We've seen this stuff over and over again. What's been interesting is the reaction by some, you know. So in this New York Times article last week, you had a Jose Serrano, the congressman, very defensive because he doesn't, you know, he wants to have Puerto Ricans, you know, presented in a positive light. So, you know, he's very trying to say, oh, this is, you know, you guys are focusing on the wrong thing. And then you have me saying, no, it's a real problem, because it is a real problem.
So why has it happened that way?
Well, you know, I think like you said, in the United States, in the Northeast, you have this problem of Puerto Rican, high levels of Puerto Rican poverty, whether it's Boston, Chicago. In places like Florida, you have a lot of middle-class people, professionals that have come from Puerto Rico there, so it's more of a mixed bag. But then you go to Texas and California, and there you have a lot of Puerto Rican professionals. So it's kind of uneven, you know, in terms of, it's hard to characterize the Puerto Rican population in one way nationally. It used to be the case up until maybe the 80s where you could do that, because we were mostly in the Northeast. But Florida, for example, is the fastest growing concentration of Puerto Ricans in the country. It's the second largest concentration of Puerto Ricans. And a lot of them have a big mix of professionals, and a lot of them also a lot of pro-statehood people, politically. So here in the Northeast, we've always been known as the basically a Commonwealth, you know, a stronghold. People support Commonwealth, support the current status, and you know, you have a fair share of radicals and people support independence, but you didn't have a big statehood presence before. Now with places like Florida having such a, you know, that kind of an influx, you have a very very complex kind of social class configuration now when you look at the community nationwide, and also politically around the issue of status. So the communities become very, very interesting. We did about 2004, we did an atlas of Puerto Ricans in the United States for the government of Puerto Rico, and we try to capture some of these things. But one of the things that was interesting about that report was that we discovered that there were now, according to the census, more Puerto Ricans in the United States than in Puerto Rico for the first time. So that was interesting, and we started talking to the government of Puerto Rico about maybe there's some things you could do to work with the community here. You could see it as a possibly economic market for products of Puerto Rico, but also there's some services you might be able to provide. So one of the things they did back then is they developed an initiative with the University of Puerto Rico to enroll Puerto Ricans from here in Puerto Rico, because of the problem with the underachievement in terms of schooling, and it turned out to be a win-win thing because you have these poor kids coming, they're eligible to get all these federal Pell Grants and all that stuff.
So they're supporting the university.
So there's a lot of interesting things that could happen, not enough, that could be happening between Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans here that could
well, why are the Puerto Ricans in New York suffering so?
Well, it's not, like I said, it's not just New York, Boston, Chicago,
in urban
Philadelphia.
So it's a lot of the big
in the
urban
Northeast
centers,
primarily.
Because there's so much competition.
Well,
for jobs.
What happens is when Puerto Ricans came here in large numbers after World War II, because we can basically identify a Puerto Rican presence since the 1800s in New York, small but a presence. I mean, the first Puerto Rican to get elected to office, the assembly, got elected in 1938 in New York.
Who was that?
Well, his name was Oscar Garcia Rivera, and again, just as a sign of things to come, problems we're going to have, he got elected on the Republican line and the American Labor line. Then the following year, the Republicans decided not to endorse him because they said he was too much of a communist.
and that was the ALP.
So and that kind of, I think that set the tone for Puerto Rican politics from that point on. But it's not until the 50s that you really begin to, again, see Puerto Ricans get elected to office. But Puerto Ricans came to play a certain function here in terms of working in the service economy, manufacturing. And as you know, the story is that stuff all kind of disappeared. And what we found, which was kind of interesting, is that we compared the Puerto Rican experience in New York with the black experience. In the black case, there was a civil rights movement, and there was a whole effort to try to find ways to integrate the black community at different levels. And one of the things we found were the role of public service employment, public employment in blacks. So today, for example, you have blacks overrepresented in city and state jobs. Not at the higher levels, but you have an overrepresentation, which is a reflection of that movement. And that created a strong, lower middle class communities in the black community. In the Latino case, in the Puerto Rican case, you didn't have that response. People didn't know what to make of these Puerto Rican people. And so we really got hit really hard when you had a shifting from a manufacturing to a service economy. And that really hit the community hard. The response in the Puerto Rican case back then was welfare, was a welfare system. And so you created a real problem there because you wound up having a lot of folks really dependent on government and creating, the kind of this problems that welfare creates in terms of just destroying families and all that. And then, it made the community so vulnerable that you wind up today with a situation where this community has a very high poverty rate. Kids are, the term of the CSS report is a disconnected youth, that whole thing. And it's something that hasn't been attended to. So there was a time when a CSS report, something like this, like in the 60s or in the 70s, might garner all sorts of support, outcry by foundations and public officials. Today, this stuff comes out and people go, it's like interesting, oh, it's terrible, but there's no real serious response by government. You don't see foundations jumping in like they used to.
Right.
You don't have the because we've had so many years of people blaming the victim. I hate to use that term; it's cliche now, but saying that this is a problem of individual responsibility, and the whole structural aspect of this, the whole historical aspect of this gets thrown out the window, and so you wind up with a lot of city officials shrugging. You saw that big a few years ago anti-poverty program by the Mayor Bloomberg, which was like let's pay people, which is has some problems. But that obviously hasn't been effective, and you haven't heard the mayor say anything about this issue.
And now also the identity has been merged with all the Latino groups, right?
Well, that's the other thing, because then you have a very complex situation because you have all these groups that are coming in under different circumstances. And the CSS report pointed out that all the Latino groups, the young people, are having serious problems. So it's not just Puerto Ricans, it's just that the Puerto Rican aspect of it is like a big surprise. But one of the things is, what I notice, and I'm very involved with a lot of census statistical stuff. That's
I was going to ask you about the census.
And what happens is that we're finding as the Latino community becomes more complex, more diverse, the data that the city, for example, collects becomes more, simplified. So there was a time when in the school system you'd have data on the kids, and the Hispanic data would be broken up Puerto Rican and other Spanish speaking. So you got a sense of what was happening with Puerto Rican kids and then the other kids. And that's at a time when Puerto Ricans were overwhelmingly most of the kids in the school system. Today, Puerto Ricans are like maybe a third of the Latino population. Dominicans maybe a quarter, and then you have Ecuadorians, Colombians, Mexicans, on and on and on. Yeah. And now they only collect data on Hispanics. So I have no idea when they say the Hispanic dropout rate is this or Hispanics.
Whether
I don't know. Is it the new kids? Is it the Puerto Ricans? And so the Puerto Ricans get lost in there. And people make assumptions. The other assumption that the CSS report tries to go against is that it's just a language problem. They just got here, and it's just that they don't know the language and stuff. And the problem is most of these kids, especially the Puerto Ricans, are English speaking. Right. They're not newcomers. Most of them were born here, so you have these false kinds of approaches, public policy approaches, like solution is bilingual education. And you know how controversial that's been. And now you don't hear much about it because it's been kind of like demoted into something. But in the bilingual programs, it's always been a very minority of Latino kids that were eligible for these programs. You're talking about 16%.
Because they all spoke English.
Yeah, and so the other 80%, nobody paid attention to them. So you wind up with these kinds of
Is there also a difference in that I don't know if it's factual or not, but the impression is a lot of the Mexican people who come here are coming here to make money and send it back home and eventually to go back home.
Well, no.
Is that a difference?
Oh, no. No, I'm saying it is a real difference.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to get into stereotyping, but
right.
There is a difference. Obviously, there's a difference in terms of immigrants that come here to work versus kids that grew up here. Yeah. So you find, for example, people complain like Black and Puerto Rican kids and increasingly Dominican kids, they're not going to take certain jobs. Right. Because they've been, the irony, they've been Americanized, so I ain't going to take no junky job paying nothing. And meanwhile, you have a lot of newer immigrants from various communities that they'll take any job. And so ironically, you'll have a lower poverty rate because, you might have a situation where, everybody's working at these sub-paid, these baloney jobs paying. But the household income all of a sudden is higher because you have the problem of people doubling up in illegal apartments and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard to kind of break out the statistics because of these complications.
So I don't remember in political history so much attention being paid to Latinos, Hispanics. Part of it's because of the immigration, but also both the parties seem to be wooing the vote.
Well, what's
it's
to
so
me,
interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's fascinating is I look at the media, and there was a time when we couldn't get much coverage unless it was some horrible thing like remember the Cape Man in the 50s?
I remember
some
that.
Horrible thing like that. Then all of a sudden, in the 1980s, there's this thing of the decade of the Hispanic. Then all of a sudden, you have people discovering this community. First, you have corporations saying, "Wait a minute." A lot of these people may be on welfare or whatever, but it's still money. And because, I mean, when I grew up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, I watched the commercials for McDonald's. To me, it was like McDonald's was something I never seen, only in commercials. They never would come into my neighborhood. Now there's a McDonald's in my neighborhood. There's too many of these things. So all of a sudden we get discovered as, an economic force, as a market. Then you have the political parties all of a sudden saying they don't participate a lot. The participation levels are lower. But there's a lot of them. So even if they participate, there's still a lot of voters. We got to pay attention to these people. And you have this attention also. So you go from no attention, people ignoring you. You have groups like the Young Lords in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, doing all sorts of interesting things in El Barrio, garbage offensives, all these things. And the reason they were able to carry a lot of this stuff off is because people didn't pay attention to El Barrio. They didn't care. All of a sudden, these young people are doing all these things, and then they start paying attention. But ironically, a lot of the progressive stuff that was going on was possible because people weren't paying attention. So they had no idea what to make of these people.
I see. That's interesting.
Now we're in a situation where it's very different. The media is paying attention to us. You know, like I said, the political parties are paying attention to us. I've never seen so much polling of Latinos in my life. It's still not that great. It's very uneven, but I remember being part of a conference in the late 1980s. We had it in Texas on Latino polling. We were criticized. We had the conference because we called the conference "Ignored Voices" because we couldn't get the pollsters to pay attention to us.
Right, and the census.
Yeah, and now it's like a big deal. And when the census comes out every 10 years now, it's like a whole thing about Latinos. Oh my God, there's so many. In the Latino community, go, oh, this is great. There are a lot of us. You know, we're going to have more political power. In the rest of the country, people are saying, oh no, these people, they're taking over. They're going to destroy the country. So you get these kinds of reactions, which we never had before, long before. And so we have a lot of people, for example, now messing around with our agenda. You know, so you have the corporations, you know, buying off community organizations and influencing them. The political parties are now polling us like crazy. There's all this market research. So we're getting all this attention. And then there are all these nice articles about, you know, there's a thing called Hispanic Magazine, Hispanic Business Magazine. It's our growing middle class is projecting itself as a very, very positive light. And you have all these nice commercials now, you know, with Latinos in them. And it's all very positive. You have the Hispanic media, which is not owned by Hispanics. Univision and Telemundo are not owned by Latinos. You know, a lot of people don't know that. You
General Electric or what? Right.
General Electric, NBC, and then you have you know, some private guys that run Univision. And then their interest, see, is that they've been complaining over the years that their ad revenue is less than it should be because since corporations feel Hispanics are low income, we don't have to pay them as much as we pay the regular stations. Right. So they have this motivation to try to emphasize how well we're doing. So you wind up with all this machinery that gives a projection of Latinos as politically powerful, as doing very well. Meanwhile, the reality is you have these very, very high poverty rates. You have these problems with the school dropouts that are there and kind of get overshadowed with all this positive stuff. And people sometimes really think that Latinos are a very, very powerful group, very influential. And I just don't get it. I mean, I look around here in New York, one of the saddest things to see is after fighting for political empowerment to try to, you know, redistricting, to try to get more Latino elected officials, this is the sorriest bunch of Latino politicians I've seen in my life. I mean, half these guys are being investigated. Some of them are in jail.
It's like it's also a family business, isn't it?
Yeah, you think you have these little dynasties, you know, that somehow they think they're Kennedys or something. And then you have, you know, people like Espada, Hiram Montserrat, you know, Efrain Gonzalez, who, you know, the young Dominican guy, Martinez, who's in jail. Yeah. It's awful. And one of the other things that's been a problem, and this, I sound like I'm venting, so I apologize.
You are, but it's all right.
One of the things that is a real challenge for us in the work we do is that when you compare Latinos with other communities, what you find is that we don't have very diverse leadership. We've put most of our eggs in one basket, and that is elected.
Let me just say something. It's no different with other groups, is it?
Well,
I don't think the white leadership in this state is so great.
Oh, no, I don't mean, I'm not talking about, what I'm saying is, what I find in the Latino community is really problematic in terms of advocacy, is that there's been too much of a focus and reliance on elected officials, whereas if you look in the black community, for example, you have the church leaders, you have some business leaders, you know, and we don't have that. So, so you might have a black entertainment, you know, television that's owned by blacks and stuff. Well, our equivalent is Univision, which is not owned by Latinos. So what we have is this thing where we're over-reliant. So this terrible corruption that we see in the political class in general disproportionately affects our community.
We're almost at the end of this program, but let me just say, when it comes to poverty and number of people, aren't there more white people living in poverty in the country?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's in terms of numbers.
We also lose that perspective, don't we? Yeah. When we just concentrate here and just say that, so it's something for everybody to remember. That
well, it's important to make those connections because otherwise it's not something that's just unique to
and I want people to think that, and they do, don't they?
Oh, yeah.
So it's fascinating. Well, who has been nationally Do you have good representation?
Well, you know, I think people like Nidia Velázquez here in New York and Jose Serrano have been pretty clean, first of all, and I think they've been very effective in their roles. And I just wish they would get more active locally than they have been. Although Nidia Velázquez now is working with the Cuomo people, so she's doing that. But at the more local level, we have this guy, Gustavo Rivera, who beat out Espada in his hopes that he represents a new generation.
Was somebody in East Harlem?
Roberto Rodriguez is one guy who got elected there. So the hope is that some of these guys will be, you know, kind of, well, you have Melissa Mark Viverito on the city council. So the hope is that there's a new generation coming up, but boy, we have a lot of work to do.
Well, so do we. I mean, everybody does. But what about nationally? What happened as a result of all these campaigns and the immigration question?
Well,
do Puerto Ricans feel as, are they as strong participants in the question of immigration?
Surprisingly so. Surprisingly so. People generally don't think that would be the case, but you have someone like Luis Gutierrez, a congressman from Chicago, who is probably the major leader in the Congress around immigration reform. And you have Nidia Velázquez and Jose Serrano, who are very supportive of immigration reform issues.
Very good.
So, yeah.
So let's end on an optimistic note. What do we have to say?
Well, you know that despite all these problems, there are people still out there fighting, and the spirit isn't gone. There are a lot of challenges, but you know, American society right now is at a crossroads, I think, politically and in many other ways. And I think for the Latino community, in many ways, like the CSS report and others point out, when you look at the age group, the Latinos very much the future of America. So it'll be interesting if people are able to make that connection, able to make the connection between the economic well-being of the United States and the role that positive role that immigration plays. I mean, we'll have to wait and see what happens.
And the breadth of the audience for progressive policies.
Well, you know, that's, I tell you, one of the most disappointing parts of the work I do is to see how many progressives really have also become kind of racially fatigued and don't want to deal with these issues.
They've got to wake up, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think so, because they, you know, like I said, I think Latinos in many ways are a big part of the future of this country.
They certainly are. Thank you, Angelo Falcón. It's gone so quickly. I'm breathless, but thank you very much, and I hope you'll come back again.
Sure, it'd be my pleasure.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.